Friday episode of this podcast. But it is funny because we were talking this morning about, we don't have that much to talk about because nothing had happened since Thursday, really, in terms of, any news for the first segment, which is usually where we kind of plug the news that's happened. And then wouldn't you know it, 10 minutes after we have that conversation, the Saints agree to terms with Bryan Edwards, which it's rare to get to the day that the team signs a contract with a player without having already learned about the team signing a contract with the player. But that's what happened. Like, it was only about 30 minutes before he put pen to paper that it was actually reported that Bryan Edwards had signed with the Saints, which is kind of rare, which means that we actually got to talk to Bryan today. So we will have some sound for you to play in this segment of the interview with Bryan after he signed his contract. So that'll be something. But yeah, it's not necessarily a surprise to me that the Saints went after Bryan Edwards. What is a surprise to me is I feel like I heard about Bryan Edwards a lot more than his stats with the Raiders would indicate. Like, it felt like he was working with Derek Carr for a while, and it felt like he had some success there, but it was only 2 seasons, and the numbers are not exactly jumping off the page at you. He, in his rookie season, which is 2020, he was a 3rd-round pick, by the way, out of South Carolina, 6'3", about 215 pounds, 11 catches on 15 targets, 193 yards and a touchdown. 2021, 34 catches on 59 targets, which isn't a terrible number. He's a mildly used receiver, 571 yards, 3 touchdowns. And then last year he got traded to the Falcons, really only played in a couple games, had 3 catches for 15 yards. So, it is interesting. And you kind of look at this roster and you say, where is he going to fit in? And I think the spot that he's going to be filling realistically is whatever role you had carved out for Marquez Callaway last year. I think he's going to be in a similar situation as Marquez, where you're not going to use him in the kind of regular offense, but he will be incorporated if you're without a couple players, maybe you're without a Michael Thomas or a Chris Olave or Rashid Shaheed, then he would be kind of that first guy off the bench. And that's why I think that familiarity with Derek Carr is very helpful in this regard.
Yeah, pretty curious to see, what more he can bring to the wide receiver room right now. I know he's a pretty, big body guy. You think contested catches, but I just, there hasn't been that much development, even with Derek Carr, even though he spent 2 years with him. So there's some familiarity there. I doubt this is someone that, Carr's going to be looking at as a quote unquote security blanket or anything. You just start thinking about names coming over from the Raiders, and you would think that they would have, I thought there'd be more familiarity too with each other. I guess like what you were saying.
He wasn't even on the Raiders last year.
Right. And then I think he had like even a cup of coffee with the Chiefs.
Yeah, he ended up on their practice squad, but he never got in a game.
Right.
I think he was on the Falcons for 7 games. He was there in that week 1 game with the Saints. So he was on the field. He had a target in that game. He didn't have a catch. So he got to experience that. That was like his whirlwind experience in Atlanta included that game. So that's unfortunate for him.
Well, hopefully he can come here and challenge the Saints underachieving 3rd-round draft pick at wide receiver.
Yeah, he and Traquan can hang out and have blocking competitions.
There you go. Right.
One thing that I did think was interesting is while he said that Derek Carr's signing here kind of made this a more likely landing spot for him, he didn't actually talk to Derek Carr. He had not talked to Derek Carr as of the time we talked to him today, which is kind of interesting. And here's what he had to say about that situation in general.
Honestly, I didn't, just kind of knowing who he is as a person and knowing, what you're going to get out of him. I didn't really need to. I kind of, built up a relationship with him, and you know what you're going to get out of Derek. You're going to get somebody who works hard and who's, willing to put himself out there and willing to lead. So I didn't really need to talk to him much.
But yeah, like he speaks highly of Derek Carr, but it's not like these two guys are like kismet. Like they're not like good. I mean, I think there's respect there. There's mutual respect there, but it's not like, like the Raiders brought in Devontae Adams, who Derek Carr played with at Fresno State. And that was very specifically done because there is a relationship there and they like playing with each other. And I don't know if that is necessarily this situation other than they're comfortable playing together. And that's a good start. And I think as you're learning a new offense, having someone doing it at the same time that you do share kind of a language with is helpful. I think it's the same reason the Saints were interested in bringing in Foster Moreau. And that obviously didn't work for obvious crazy reasons. He got diagnosed with cancer. So I think this was kind of their concession of, we wanted a guy who can maybe be a big bodied receiver. We wanted a guy who is kind of in the same boat of coming from the Raiders to here and learning that new system. And Bryan just made a lot of sense.
Yeah, it wasn't like he came out and was like, "Oh yeah, me and Derek, we're boys,"
right?
Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, it did not. I did not get that sense at all that that they hung out on the weekends or anything like that. Like, if for them not to be in contact at all, it means that Bryan probably doesn't have his cell phone number. Because like, wouldn't you text him?
Guess what, dude? Right.
So
we're getting
like,
the band back together.
Yeah. Which is not. It's not an issue per se. Maybe Bryan lost his cell phone when he went to Atlanta and he just doesn't have his numbers, right? Like there's a lot of reasons that might be the case, but it is like, a lot of times you'll hear that interview and there's no reason not to be like, oh yeah, that's my boy, and in this case, it just was not that interaction at all.
No, I'm sure they were good teammates and all, but it definitely wasn't something where, like you said, it was this spark and there's this connection, and it was maybe Derek Carr going to the Saints, hey, why don't you maybe bring Edwards in, kind of thing. I don't even think, Carr was probably like, who?
Yeah, I think that's I don't think that, but I think that's a good way to phrase it. It's like Derek didn't go to the Saints and be like, can you get me Bryan Edwards?
Right.
Like that's not what drew this. Whereas it could still work. I think they do work pretty well together in that, like, Bryan Edwards didn't have a great season, but 30 catches, 500 yards, 3 touchdowns. There is production there. Funny thing about Bryan Edwards is I actually covered him when he was in high school in Conway, South Carolina. It was almost a decade ago. It was in 2013. And I just vividly remember this. The quarterback throwing the ball was named Peyton Derrick. Which it's just like, that's such a unique combination of names that fits this team so perfectly. Peyton Derrick. Derek Carr's throwing on the ball. Sean Payton's the former. Anyway, it was spelled like Peyton Manning, but that was his first name. But I remember that game, and I remember watching it. And this was a 1-8 football team. This was not a good football team, but you saw him out there, and he was returning punts, and you were like, this guy's just a different type of athlete. Like, they would kick it away from him because if they kicked the ball to him, he was going to score every time. So they would like kick it 20 yards out of bounds, knowing that if they did anything else, they weren't going to get away with it. And he and Hunter Renfrow, they played about 13 miles apart from each other. Hunter Renfrow was a quarterback for Socastee in high school in South Carolina. And it was always kind of neat to me that they ended up on the same team in the NFL because they weren't even on the same team in college. Bryan went to South Carolina, Hunter went to Clemson, and then they met on the Raiders. And that there's nothing insightful about this whatsoever other than it's just kind of crazy. Like a decade ago, I was watching this kid play high school football in South Carolina, and now he's going to be on the Saints.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see like what exactly the rest of how this is going to shake out for the depth chart, I guess you could say, at wide receiver for the Saints. Obviously, we know you got Michael Thomas, Chris Olave. I guess after that, you'd say Rashid Shaheed or Traquan. Well, what's going to happen with a guy like Kawan Baker, Kirk Merritt, Keith Kirkwood still out there too, I mean, that's what training camp's obviously going to come for, and we'll see if there's a that connection right away that we see Carr maybe looking towards Edwards' way a little more than some others because there is a familiarity. I don't know.
Okay, so this is really random, but I had to go check to see if Kawan Baker was still on the Saints because I had a dream the other night, and this is super weird, but I had a dream that involved I remember it was like someone was saying, "Oh, this is going to be the breakout of 2023." And they were like, Kawan Baker. And I was like, wait, what do you mean? And it was like he was on like the Packers or something because the Packers came and signed him off the practice squad. And then I woke up and then and just now I was like, wait,
hit you, right?
He's still on the Saints, or did he get signed off the practice squad, or did I dream that? And apparently I dreamed that Kawan Baker got signed off the Saints practice squad. He is not. He is still there. So yes, he was suspended 6 games to start last season. I think that really undermined any chance he had to have an impact on the roster. They did keep him around, so it does indicate that, at least to some extent, the Saints do like him. They drafted him in the 7th round out of South Alabama. So maybe this is a year where he can fight for a bigger role because, as we kind of alluded to, Marquez Callaway is out of town. Jarvis Landry is still a free agent. So there are roster spots to be had. Marquez Callaway signed with the Broncos. Sean Payton is kind of getting the gang back together. He also signed Tony Jones Jr. and Lil Jordan Humphrey. Also lured Joe Vitt out of retirement. Everyone remember Joe Vitt?
I did see that was being rumored out there. I didn't know if it was Joe's decided to come back, huh?
From what I saw, he's coming back. Sean lured him out of retirement. So yeah. And so he's got a very familiar looking staff up there. You got Michael Lombardi, you got Declan Doyle, you got Zach Strief. It's basically Saints West at this point. But I mean, there are openings to be had in this wide receiver room. I don't think Bryan Edwards is necessarily a lock to make the roster. It's going to depend on how things go in camp, right? And if a guy like Kawan Baker shows up and impresses, if a guy like Kirk Merritt shows up and impresses, I think this is a year where you have the top end depth on the roster, but you don't have the bottom end side of that equation. So whoever stands out on special teams, whoever stands out in their role could be on the roster. And that could be Brian, it could be Kirk, could be Kawan, could be any of these guys, could be, draft pick number, whatever. I do expect the Saints will use at least one draft pick on a wide receiver. But yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting position to watch this year for sure.
Yeah, there's, like you said, the draft, and then obviously afterwards, the undrafted rookies. There always seems to be that story with this team. Who knows? It'll be interesting. Like I said, training camp time, that's definitely a position that I think there's a lot more, I guess you would say, more battles to watch for snaps than many would think, just because you're hoping, obviously, you have, your Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, and Rashid Shaheed as, I think, your top 3.
Yeah, and someone's going to make this team as a kick returner. Because Rashid's not going to be he will be the kick returner, but he is also going to be incorporated in the offense. So I imagine he will only take one of 2. Like, I don't think he's going to be a full-time wide receiver and a full-time punt returner and a full-time kick returner. I think you'll probably try to have him either kick return or punt return and then have someone else handle the opposite to kind of keep that load a bit off of him. I would guess he returns punts and then you have someone else returning kicks. That would be my guess. So, if one of these wide receivers kind of stands out, and I don't think Bryan Edwards is that guy, that's just not, he's 6'3", 215. He's not a speedster. I think that's going to be a role. I think Marcus Sherrills was a guy they brought in way back when. Like, it could be a defensive back, right? Like, it's not unheard of to have a defensive back return kicks. But they just typically wouldn't see the ball skills, so you'd be a little more concerned about the ball security back there. Either way, like with Deontay gone, with Marquez gone, those were your, Marquez was always the safety net at returning, and he's gone now. Deontay's gone, right? So there's going to have to be somebody who can, like, what if Rashid gets hurt? Who's going to return kicks?
Just have Taysom do it.
Well, right. Maybe that is where you go. But either way, you're going to have to figure something out for a secondary returner. And so, who knows? Maybe Kawan can do that. He's a fast guy.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I hadn't really considered him. I don't know if he's done that, obviously, in the past. But yeah, that was something curious, I thought, too, even with last year when he got suspended, that even as a 7th round draft pick, I thought his time was very, shortcoming. His end was near for the Saints, but they decided to keep him around. They must like what they do see from him.
Or even with the suspension, right? Like, they could have easily.
Yeah, right. It was like,
And he ran a 4.45 40. That's pretty good. I don't know. Either way, that's something to keep an eye on.
I'm just waiting until we can say Kawan Baker, the touchdown maker, something.
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, here's one more clip from Bryan on why he picked the Saints.
Obviously, you guys got Derek Carr, you guys got Jonathan Abram, a couple of guys that I'm pretty familiar with, and just the opportunity, man. I know, what you guys do and kind of some things you do on offense. So I felt like I'd be a great fit here, and I felt like it'd be a great opportunity for me and my family. I just feel like I bring a willing competitor, somebody who's willing to do whatever it takes to make the roster and to contribute.
This is a guy who I think had a rough year last year, right? Like he's a 3rd-round pick. He got cut in year 3. He got traded from the Raiders to the Falcons and then got cut from a bad roster in Atlanta. Like that was not a good team. They got rid of Calvin Ridley, right? So like they didn't have Calvin Ridley because he was suspended anyway. So, I mean, you're talking about a guy who got cut from a very subpar roster. And so I think he's going to have to prove something to this Saints team to make sure that they actually keep him around.
Yeah, the biggest thing I guess you want to hope for, obviously, there was talent there, obviously, to be a 3rd-round pick. We haven't seen really.
He was good at South Carolina,
but we haven't really seen enough from him, obviously, in the NFL. Hopefully, coming to this Saints team, is some kind of spark lit beneath him, and he gets that chip on his shoulder, I guess, because, yeah, right now, just looking at numbers only, nothing really stands out to you that, makes me really overly excited about the signing.
Yeah, I mean, in college, he had 234 catches for 3,045 yards and 22 touchdowns. So, like, he was very productive in college. And I think if Bryan makes this roster, it's going to be because he shows that he can excel at contested catches. That is something that Dennis Allen pointed to specifically at the end of last season, saying we need to be better in that area. We really didn't have anybody who could do that. I think Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry were kind of 1A and 1B in that regard. Like you brought in Jarvis Landry because he was that guy. And if Mike Thomas went down, you could turn to him. Well, they both went down. But I think you still do want to have someone behind Mike who can at least, I don't think anyone's going to replicate what Mike can do. But in the sense that they are physically similar and you can at least run your offense the same way, I think that's what your goal is here. And I don't know if anyone else on this roster can do that. So if for Bryan Edwards, I think, more so than special teams, like he's going to have to play special teams. I think that during camp, he's going to have to prove that he can be, I don't want to say elite, but be upper echelon in terms of you're not going to get wide open separation, but you got to be able to go up and box out these smaller players and make plays. And if he can do that, then he is a useful person for this team, because I'm not going to sit here and bet on Mike Thomas playing 17 games. Even if he's healthy, I think you're probably looking at 14, 15, right? Like I think he's a maintenance guy, right? Like you see that in the NBA, load maintenance. I think you have to be cognizant of that with Mike. So having someone who can slot in is important. And that's the big thing with Bryan. That's what we're going to have to watch for in training camp.
No, like you mentioned, definitely Dennis Allen mentioning the contested catch aspect is going to be something huge. And hopefully whoever does come into can sit down with Chris Olave a little and help him out.
Yeah, that is going to be something to watch with Chris. He talked about at the end of last season getting stronger, getting more physically imposing, so he's not getting bullied as much as he goes downfield. And so hopefully he can do that. Hopefully that is something he's put a lot of time in this offseason. So because I'm very interested to see how he progresses from year 1 to year 2, because I think he does a lot of things really, really well, but he does some very specific things not well, right? Like he is not a perfectly all-around receiver right now, or at least he wasn't last year. And part of that is ball security. Part of that is going up and making a tough catch. And then part of that is getting open, and he gets open as well as anybody. What he needs to do is make catches when he isn't able to create 5-yard separation. What he needs to be able to do is go to the ground with the ball and not drop it. And so, yeah, there's all that you're going to have to watch for.
That's one of the thing up there. It might have been, maybe at sometimes it was a bad thing last year, but you could always tell the gears were always turning up there for him. He definitely a very cerebral, I feel like, wide receiver too. And maybe you definitely know where he's going to sit down and look at the tape and obviously know where he needs to make improvements. I just see that same kind of desire that you had with a Michael Thomas, that want there constantly. We'll see how he comes in at camp, because the bulking up body wise is definitely something that's going to be needed, even though he shunned away from it. I remember when first drafted, and then it was like, nah, I'm gonna need to bulk up a little bit here.
Yeah, he learned throughout his first season. And I think Mike Thomas, too, is a good example of someone who he didn't always look like he does now. Like when he came into the league, he was a much thinner looking frame, and he bulked up significantly in years 2 and 3. And so that's something that I don't think Chris wants to get too bulky. I think part of what makes him good is being able to be smooth down the field and transition into and out of his breaks. And so you don't want to add too much weight and lose some of that. But I think there's a middle ground, and he's got to find it. But all right, let's